White House shakeup. The president's chief of staff is on his way out. Which candidates are emerging to be his replacement? Pro-life defeat. The Supreme Court refuses to hear a case involving the defunding of Planned Parenthood. How Justice Brett Kavanaugh played a role in the case. Advising the Pope. The Holy Father meets with his trusted group of cardinals. We have a preview from Rome. And larger than life. The Philippines pulls out all the stops in its Christmas preparations. On EWTN News Nightly for Monday, December 10th, 2018. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you to those of you joining us from around the world for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Shake up at the White House with President Trump looking for a new chief of staff. General John Kelly is leaving on January 2nd, but plans for an orderly succession are not panning out. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Lauren. President Trump's top pick for the job, Nick Ayers, announced Sunday he would instead be leaving the White House. Now, that surprised even senior staffers. At least a half dozen people are reportedly under consideration.
Some of the names floated to oversee West Wing staff: Mick Mulvaney, the Office of Management and Budget Director; Congressman Mark Meadows, Republican chair of the House Freedom Caucus; Matt Whitaker, the acting Attorney General; former Deputy Trump campaign manager David Bossie; Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin; and U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer. President Trump announced the change over the weekend.
John Kelly will be leaving, but I don't know if I can say retiring, but he's a great guy. John Kelly will be leaving at the end of the year.
General Kelly had been credited with bringing order to the West Wing after he became chief of staff in summer 2017. But he alienated some longtime allies of the president and became increasingly isolated in the West Wing.
I appreciate his service very much.
Immediately, the vice president's right-hand man was named as the likely replacement. But Nick Ayers shut the speculation down with a single tweet. "Thank you at Real Donald Trump at VP and my great colleagues for the honor to serve our nation at the White House. I will be departing at the end of the year, but will work with the MAGA team to advance the cause." On his own Twitter feed, President Trump denying reports that Ayers was his surefire pick. "I'm in the process of interviewing some really great people for the position of White House Chief of Staff. Fake news has been saying with certainty it was Nick Ayers, a spectacular person who will always be with our MAGA agenda. I will be making a decision soon."
As you know, Lauren, Budget Director Mick Mulvaney is Catholic. You asked him during an interview how his faith impacts his work. He said he couldn't do his job here at the White House without his Catholic faith. We'll see if Mulvaney's name remains as the president narrows down a short list for chief of staff. Lauren.
White House correspondent Mark Irons. Thank you, Mark. Former FBI Director James Comey must return to Capitol Hill for more closed-door questioning. He was brought in last week to discuss Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. During the meeting, Republicans questioned him about his role in the Hillary Clinton email investigation.
You will see that we're talking again about Hillary Clinton's emails, for heaven's sake, so I'm not sure we need to do this at all. But I'm trying to respect the institution and to answer questions in a respectful way.
In a tweet, President Trump wrote, "Leakin' James Comey must have set a record for who lied the most to Congress in one day." Comey later told an audience in New York that he hopes voters kick President Trump out of office in the next election. The Supreme Court refuses to hear a high-profile case involving Planned Parenthood. Among those who voted against hearing it, newly minted Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. Correspondent Jason Calvi reports outside the Supreme Court. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Lauren. The question here is who has the right to challenge the state's Medicaid funding decisions, private individuals or only the federal government? The Supreme Court doesn't want to get involved in answering that question.
The highest court in the land rejects two states trying to defund Planned Parenthood. Pro-life leaders are disappointed.
This is the Supreme Court's job to decide whether states can defund Planned Parenthood.
Americans United for Life's general counsel filed a brief urging the Supreme Court to pick up the case.
States are not sure if they can defund Planned Parenthood from Medicaid, and yet Planned Parenthood affiliates across the country have been implicated in fraud, waste, and even abuse of taxpayer dollars to the tune of tens of millions of dollars. And that is something that the states took steps to remedy?
Yeah, there's researchers that are actively using fetal tissue products.
These undercover videos released in 2015 sparked a national outcry. They allegedly showed Planned Parenthood profiting from the sale of aborted baby parts. Some states moved to strip Medicaid funds from the abortion provider. Planned Parenthood and some of their patients sued. Kansas and Louisiana countered, saying only the federal government can challenge the states, not private parties. But most lower courts ruled against the states, so they appealed to the Supreme Court. Only 3 justices wanted to hear the case: Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, and Neil Gorsuch. In their dissent, Justice Thomas writes, "So what explains the court's refusal to do its job here? I suspect it has something to do with the fact that some respondents in these cases are named Planned Parenthood. That makes the court's decision particularly troubling, as the question presented has nothing to do with abortion." Brett Kavanaugh was among the justices who opted not to hear the case.
Planned Parenthood's new president praised the court's order, saying politics was getting in the way of people making their own health care choices. Americans United for Life is still hopeful that the Supreme Court will weigh the heart of the controversy in other cases. And the question there, can states defund Planned Parenthood? Lauren?
Correspondent Jason Calvi, thank you for that comprehensive report. Joining me now is Christopher Bedford, editor-in-chief of the Daily Caller. Chris, welcome back to the broadcast.
Thanks for having me.
We heard about the split in the conservatives on the Supreme Court, that Thomas, Alito, and Gorsuch wanted to hear it. Roberts and Kavanaugh did not. Is this significant?
Yeah, it's political. It's basically entirely political. That's why you saw Clarence Thomas say, "I don't understand why we wouldn't bring this up." The Supreme Court's job is basically to make a ruling when the lower courts disagree. And as of right now, different areas of the United States, the law is being brought down in a different way, where some states are allowed to remove Planned Parenthood's funding, or in other states, the individuals have the ability to petition the state and to sue over that. When the law is split, the Supreme Court has to step in and decide. And this obviously, it wasn't a legal question here. It was a political question by Roberts and Kavanaugh.
We heard in Jason's report, pro-life groups like Americans United for Life are disappointed that they declined to rule on this procedural question. Are we likely to see this come up again in front of the High Court?
Yes. This is simply a delay. It's most likely because Roberts and Kavanaugh feel that the court has been dragged into a dangerous place by the Kavanaugh hearings. People have become partisan. They don't want the court to have the polling that Congress has, the polling that the executive has, because they want to stay above that fray. And they've got pretty good polling right now with the American people. And they feel like if they jumped right into an issue as controversial as abortion, then they would hurt the name of the court. But they also know this is necessarily has to come back before them because, again, the law is divided throughout the country, and you can't have that.
Mainstream media are labeling this as a win for Planned Parenthood. NBC writing online, quote, "Supreme Court gives victory to Planned Parenthood in Medicaid case." There's this headline then from CNN, and it reads, "Supreme Court sides with Planned Parenthood in funding fight, and is this a victory for the pro-abortion group?" Your thoughts?
It's a temporary victory because the Supreme Court very likely would have said no, Planned Parenthood could not weigh this. But they didn't actually make a ruling. So it's a delay, which does help the people who are pro-abortion. But there's even maybe possibly a Catholic perspective to this outside of abortion, in that the government saying that you can't take Medicare or Medicaid funding could be something that under, say, President Obama, a future president who agrees with him, something that impacts maybe Catholic hospitals. If you don't do gender reassignment, if you don't provide abortion, then we can take your funding. And so far, this could be a tool for Catholics and other religious people to push back against a state government that's attacking them.
Before we go, I want to turn to the recent EWTN legal victory in its 7-year fight against the Obama administration's contraceptive mandate. EWTN chairman and CEO Michael Warsaw wrote in the New York Post this weekend that it was Religious Freedom 2, Obamacare 0 was the headline. He went on to say, "The fight remains necessary for other people of faith who face continuing battles to keep and practice their faith at home and in the public square." Your thoughts?
Absolutely. This battle is not ever going to end. It's 2,000 years old, it's 4,000 years old. It's going to continue forever, where if you're a person who has a moral stance in a government that's essentially not a Christian government, then you're constantly going to have to fight to be represented in that government. And the way that society is moving right now, broadly, even without the help of the Obama administration anymore, is still towards a idea that Christian and Christian beliefs are considered bigoted by large segments of society. And if you want to hold to that, then you're going to have to practice publicly.
Thank you so much, Christopher Bedford, editor-in-chief of the Daily Caller.
Thank you.
2 Jesuit provinces covering nearly half of the U.S. released the names of 153 priests and ministry leaders who are credibly accused of sexual abuse dating from 1950. No one on either list is still in public ministry. Many of them are dead. A third province of Jesuits will release its findings next week. Lawmakers in Ohio have delayed voting on a proposal to ban abortion once a baby's heartbeat is detected. Republican Governor John Kasich promises to veto the plan. The delay raises questions over whether lawmakers will be able to override the veto before the close of the legislative session. A court in Chile says hospitals and clinics cannot opt out of performing legal abortions. Conservative Party lawmakers say the law violates freedom of conscience, but the ruling cannot be appealed. The Catholic country last year legalized abortion if the mother's life is in danger or in the case of rape. Prime Minister Theresa May postpones Parliament's vote on her plan for Britain to leave the European Union, sending the British pound plummeting. May says lawmakers would have rejected the proposal, but continues to defend it.
All the analysis shows that if you wish to deliver Brexit, if you wish to honour the result of the referendum, then the deal that does that best protects jobs and our economy, is the deal that the government has put forward.
The delay throws Brexit into disarray, and no new date has been set for Parliament's vote. The country's departure remains scheduled for late March. Heads of states and top diplomats from around the world sign on to a sweeping international agreement on migration. Catholic aid groups say the accord supports the safe and humane movement of all people. But the biggest country not on board is the United States. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsby reports from the State Department. Good evening, Wyatt.
Good evening, Lauren. Top diplomats here are not holding back in criticizing this global compact, which is spearheaded by the United Nations. The U.S. mission to the UN warns the agreement challenges national sovereignty and will lead to an influx of migrants. Despite the fierce opposition, most countries agree it's a step in the right direction.
Je n'entends pas d'objection.
With the sound of a gavel, more than 160 countries reach an agreement on the non-binding Global Compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration.
Und meine Damen und Herren, es lohnt sich noch einmal daran zu erinnern.
German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who welcomed hundreds of thousands of refugees from the Middle East to her country, hailed this as an important day while speaking at a UN conference in Morocco. The work on the document began 2 years ago, after the UN, along with the Obama administration, approved a declaration saying no country could manage international migration alone, so they needed to work together. The Trump administration withdrew its support a year ago, saying parts of the deal were inconsistent with U.S. immigration and refugee policies. During the presidential campaign, then candidate Donald Trump criticized Angela Merkel for her stance on immigration.
She's in the process of destroying Germany with the migration. We have to help the people with the migration. We have to create a safe zone someplace in Syria. But I don't want them coming into this country. I don't want them, because we don't know who they are.
The problem hits close to home for Americans. Across the southern border, hundreds of Central American migrants are still camped outside shelters. Catholic activists, like this priest, are trying to help the migrants register for work in Mexico. In September, Catholic Relief Services joined with other faith-based groups in voicing their support for the Global Compact. Joan Rosenhauer with Jesuit Refugee Service USA told me it's vital governments around the world also recognize the work of Catholic groups who work to provide a better life for migrants and refugees.
I think sometimes we forget in this country that the fact that our faith calls us to love everyone, to bring God's love into the world, to care for those who are suffering the most, people in greatest need.
Pope Francis echoing a similar sentiment today in the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He lamented the poor, the unborn, the imprisoned, saying they do not enjoy the same human rights protections as the wealthy. Now, today, Secretary Mike Pompeo also says there are many countries that still impede religious freedoms and beliefs. Lauren?
Correspondent Wyatt Goolsby reporting from the State Department. Thank you, Wyatt. A U.S. group says dozens of Christians have been detained following a raid on a Protestant church in southwest China. Among those arrested were the pastor and his wife. The communist country has cracked down this year on independent churches. That includes removing crosses from official and unofficial places of worship. The Vatican accepts the resignation of a bishop in India who is accused of misusing church funds to support his secret wife and son. The bishop denies the claims, but the 56-year-old stepped down. The group of cardinals who advise Pope Francis are meeting at the Vatican. They come together several times a year and are helping the Holy Father to reform the Roman Curia, the central government of the Church. This has been a priority for Pope Francis throughout his pontificate. Vatican correspondent Juliette Lindley joins us from Rome. Juliette, what do you expect the Pope will discuss with the cardinals?
Well, the sex abuse crisis is likely to be a top priority at the meeting, Lauren. In February, the Pope will convene a special World Summit on Abuse at the Vatican, so the Holy Father will likely want advice on how to handle it from his top advisors. Now, there's been controversy here because some of those advisors are embroiled in scandals relating to the crisis. About a month ago, Cardinal Javier Errázuriz of Chile resigned as a top advisor. His resignation comes as the church in Chile continues to deal with the fallout from its abuse scandal. Cardinal George Pell, who sits in this council, is on his side awaiting a verdict in his trial over historical sex abuse in Australia. And the coordinator of the group, Cardinal Oscar Rodriguez Maridiaga of Honduras, is facing a crisis in his own archdiocese over allegations of homosexual misconduct in his seminary and financial impropriety. So members of the council are themselves dealing with the crisis firsthand, and they're facing accusations of their own.
I remember when I was in Rome with you, Juliette, and you asked the press secretary there about whether or not there would be a reshuffling, and we did not get an answer. Do you have any information on whether or not some of those members will be asked to leave?
Lauren, there could be some additional resignations and some new appointments. Many of the men are 75 or older. Now, that's the traditional age in the church when bishops and cardinals retire. Cardinal Laurent Monsengo Passigna just stepped down as Archbishop of Kinshasa, and so he could also step down from this council. More importantly, Lauren, Pope Francis could want to appoint new advisors who are not touched by the clergy sex abuse scandal.
When they met in June, Juliette, the council presented Pope Francis with a proposal for implementing reform in the Roman Curia. Please tell us about that.
Well, that proposal is in a formal papal decree that's called an apostolic constitution, and it has the provisional title of Predicate Evangelium, or Preach the Gospel. Now, what it's likely to do is cement reforms and changes in the Curia that have already taken place. For instance, the streamlining of the offices in the Vatican that's occurred. Other areas it may touch on include financial transparency as it relates to the Vatican Bank. Now, the bank has been mired in scandals since the 90s, and last week, the Vatican city-state released its blueprint for reform with an emphasis on transparency and efficiency. Now, that could signal that the overall reform process is, in fact, drawing to a close.
Juliette Lindley, EWTN News Nightly Vatican correspondent. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren.
Coming up, an update on the effort to help persecuted Christians in the Middle East. A bill on President Trump's desk would provide relief to Christians and others persecuted by ISIS in the Middle East. On Capitol Hill last month, Representative Chris Smith of New Jersey said the Iraq and Syria Genocide Relief and Accountability Act would provide aid to persecuted Christians, and it would allow authorities to arrest and convict those guilty of rape, murder, and other crimes in the region. Joining me now are Carl Anderson, Supreme Knight of the Knights of Columbus, and Archbishop Bashar Warda of Erbil, Iraq. Gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Carl, I'll start with you. The bill, which the president is expected to sign tomorrow, shows bipartisan support. Unanimous passage, something unheard of in Washington these days. Number one, does it surprise you? And number two, how helpful will this be?
Well, it's not a surprise. Sometimes these bills are passed unanimous consent because they're non-controversial. This is important because it sends a clear moral statement that America is taking action here. And it's important for another reason as well. We've got 50 years of regulations cropping up at AID and State Department. This bill is going to help brush some of that away, give it a clearer ability of the government to help these Christian communities.
Let's talk about on the ground, Your Excellency. This bill holds ISIS accountable for the crimes that have been committed. What does that mean going forward for Iraqi Christians?
It will help for the first time to get those people accountable for what they've done, and it would create a new culture, because since 2003, everyone in Iraq, for example, is talking about the corruption. But actually, there is no one have been convicted on the ground. So to stop this disease, this is for the hopefully this will set an example, or the first example, for the people to take responsible action against such corruption, a genocide, all of this. So this is really needed on the ground. And then it would do justice for the people, for the victims of ISIS, Christians and Yazidis.
Carl, your group has been integral in making this happen. Would it have happened in another administration?
Hard to say. Fact of the matter is it happened under this administration. Vice President Pence, President Trump have been very supportive. The leadership in both the House and the Senate, Congressman Chris Smith, Congresswoman Anna Eshoo, bipartisan support. So we've got it done. Now we need to move forward. We need to make it clear. This makes it clear that America is watching, the world is watching, and we can't just ignore and pass over these very vulnerable communities in Iraq.
Your Excellency, Max Primorak of USAID sat right in this seat just a few weeks ago, telling us about the efforts to restore electricity and health care, helping with education, saying these are all priorities for the United States. What are you hearing from your flock?
Well, Mac's presence came after the announcement of Vice President Pence last year that the help is going to go to the affected, to the victims of ISIS directly. And then this was followed by another visit by Mike Green and high officials. So the U.S. aid is there, and they know that now they can travel throughout the area. The devastation of all of these, the basic infrastructure is immense. A lot have been done, and we need more on this. And I hope this bill will speed the process and build on what has been achieved so far to continue the efforts, because getting the people back to the villages is important. And last Friday, we celebrated the consecration of the Mar Adday Church in the town of Karamles, which was built by the efforts and the donation of the Knights of Columbus. And that was really a good example that something had been done on the ground.
When I was there a year and a half ago, your community was working so hard to drive funding through the help of the Knights of Columbus to this area. Does this make that effort a little bit lighter on your end?
Yes. Last Friday, we celebrated the consecration of Mar Adday Church in the town of Karamles, which was rebuilt by the help of the Knights of Columbus. It was really a good sign, a great sign to all that hope had been realized. But this also to set also another example for the U.S. government that, I mean, we could do the work. We are there to help our community to survive and thrive. And I think the opening and the consecration of the church was a good message. And they were there, a good message. And hopefully this will help with the bill coming to really speed the process, because the area needs a lot of help. Still, a lot of help should be poured there.
Very good. I'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Carl Anderson, Supreme Knight of the Knights of Columbus, and Archbishop Warda of Erbil, Iraq. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Up next, Pope Francis opens the Christmas season in Italy, and the Philippines shows its Yuletide spirit. We are now in the second week of Advent, but on Saturday, Pope Francis celebrated the Feast of the Immaculate Conception with an annual tradition. The Holy Father paid homage to her statue on the front of Spanish Steps in Rome. He called on the Blessed Virgin to support all families who feel abandoned. What is believed to be the first beatification ceremony held in the Muslim world took place over the weekend. A cardinal from the Vatican presided over the ceremony in Oran, Algeria. It honored 19 Catholic monks and nuns killed in the country's civil war. They had been named martyrs earlier this year and were among 250,000 people killed in the conflict in the 1990s. Finally tonight, the Philippines is famous for its Christmas celebrations, and this one has participants floating on air. A suburban city east of Manila hosted a parade Saturday. Hundreds of people lined the 2-mile route to watch balloons and floats and fireworks. There's Santa. It was inspired by the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade in Manhattan. Christmas celebrations in the Catholic country sometimes begin in September. That looks more like Disney World than it does Macy's. Hey, where's Ronald McDonald? Where's Snoopy? Where's the Transformers? I guess they couldn't fly to the Philippines. For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, to all of you around the world, thank you for watching. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Let's keep in touch online. Follow me at Lauren Ashburn on Twitter and Lauren Ashburn EWTN on Facebook. Good night, and God bless you.